Okay, Zdrastie, drug moj. I start that way because I apologize for the delay. Somebody sent me my interview that I did with Scott Ritter. You may have seen it on the Declaring Independence channel in regards to the Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian territory that took place earlier this week on Sunday. I interviewed Scott on Monday and I uploaded it, and somebody sent me a an AI version of that interview in full Russian, and it sounds something like what I would sound like, I guess. But you know, to my Russian friends who watch my videos and turn them into uh, you know uh, Russian AI generated videos, all I'll say is "Moya Puruski очень хорошо." So there's no need. If you want me for a Russian interview, just call me. I can pretend to know what I'm saying for about 10 minutes of it. Regardless, on a much more serious note, thank you for coming into our live stream here. It's a little informal today. We're kind of getting back into the rhythm of things coming off of this conference that we just had a couple weeks ago. And one of the things, the main things that I've really been thinking about is like, how do I actually redefine the campaign? You know, the first time I ran on an interventionist principle. Nobody here was standing up against Richie Torres. Nobody was actually challenging him in the primary, let alone in the general election. And of course, I try to live my life by principle. And one of those principles is that I don't believe in the two-party system. And so here we are now. It's 2025, a year and a half to go with the election. A lot of people are focused on the mayoral race here in New York and plenty of other local election races. If you haven't seen the video where I talk about one of the local election races here in New York on District Council 8, the importance of you watching that, wherever you are in the country or even around the world, is to understand how these lobbies, these foreign entity lobbies, actually do try to control local politicians. Before they get into places like federal office. So, for example, you've got Richie Torres. He actually went to Israel through the JCRC program, the Jewish Community Relations Council. So I have a whole video up on this on my Declaring Independence YouTube channel, and you should go check it out. It's called How the Israeli Lobby Buys Your Local Politicians. And so I was just talking about a specific race that happened here in New York, but really it was something that Thomas Massey, for example, reposted about state senators who were being taken out to foreign trips, wined and dined, and suddenly they came back singing a different tune than what they were singing before in respect to the respective country that he was talking about. Regardless, today we had such a badass lineup on the International Peace Coalition. We had Ray McGovern, Scott Ritter, Colonel Richard Black, Dennis Fritz, Raphael Boshart. I mean, just like, from the tip top down of like military experts talking about the prospect of peace. And Helga, of course, being there as well, always providing a reasonable voice. And there was just an intense dialogue that broke out. Scott Ritter thinks that they're the only path forward for Ukraine is just getting blown up, and he doesn't think that there's actually a peaceful pathway forward. And other people, of course, respectfully disagreed with his analysis. It was quite fascinating to listen to how people actually think about these events and the possibility of peace. And ultimately, my take is that we don't necessarily need to leave the course of events up to them just to happen. In other words, we are not spectators in any of this. Any situation can change. People are not static, they are movable. People are able to be convinced, swayed, their minds can change. And ultimately, because people are inherently good. And that might be that might be something that is heresy today, to say that people are naturally good. And I can understand, with everything going on in the world, that you would think that you may not agree with me. You see the genocide ongoing, you see the war ongoing, but I really do believe in the Schillerian idea that a great evil provokes an even greater good, and I think all of us need to be that greater good. So going forward, what I'm doing is I'm launching something called the Bronx Renaissance Academy. And everything that is needed to rebuild a society in a great image exists here in the Bronx already. For example, there is the New York City skyline. Most of Manhattan was built from the Grand Iron Works foundry. The iron girders that make up the dome in Washington, D.C., of the Capitol were made here in the Bronx. There used to be 65 piano companies. We used to manufacture and make and refine iron and steel. The Bronx also stood up against slavery in the inception of this country during the Constitutional Convention, thanks to people like Gouverneur Morris, who went to the Constitutional Convention, who was from the Bronx, who didn't have to, but he did. And he called slavery a moral stain. And that would forever define the country if we didn't rectify it then. You have people like Congressman Jose Serrano, who was there before Richie Torres, who's a big proponent of the space program. But you also have people here that have dedicated their lives to getting peace. Some people may remember of a character that I was talking about. Oh man, whose name escapes me right now. Black Benji. He tried to bring peace among all the gangs in New York City, and he was killed as a result of it. But his death, rather than sparking outrage and sparking revenge, prompted peace. Gangs decided to dissolve in that act as a way to respond to that violent act. The Bronx is full of many, many examples, both local and international examples, of a vision for what a real United States could look like. And you look at the disarray of the Bronx today, you look at the collapse, you look at the poverty, and what you realize is that the Bronx is a perfect metaphor for the United States right now. The state of the Bronx is the state of the country. And so going forward, the Bronx will lead the United States. And I mean that in every way possible. If the Bronx can develop and rebuild, which we will do by proposing major policy proposals, the United States can rebuild as well. That's what the Bronx Renaissance Academy will be like. So today, we are going to actually be rereading Hop Frog. But before, I want to play you just a 5-minute excerpt of the story by Poe on Hop Frog, and I want to play it by this is a recitation by Christopher Lee. Some people may know him that he played Count Dracula in the 1960s Hammer horror films, which was the reason why we have sequels. And he was also the Mummy. And he was apparently a direct descendant of Charlemagne, indirectly from Italian nobility. And he also served as an intelligence officer in the British Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. And they were responsible for espionage, sabotage, and wet works. Lee was part of the Central Registry of War Crimes and Security Suspects. These were the people involved in tracking down war criminals, which means he was personally familiar with the rat line. So if you're hearing this recitation from the standpoint of a person that has a lifelong familiarity, if not outright affiliation with oligarchy, aristocracy, and its discontents, therefore you want to hear a portion of that reading without, excuse me. That's why we're reading this story here today. And frankly, in this case, I also think that this story was written in the Bronx because of when it was published, when it being so late. And Poe lived his last years here in the Bronx. So I'm going to play this 5-minute segment here, and then we will read the story in its entirety with a couple of new guest readers. So here we go. Share tab audio. Yep. All right. And
Hop Frog. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favour. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine, but certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days. Days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But, as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that in Hop Frog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors of baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the 7 ministers, on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king. But although Hop Frog, through the distortions of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many great feats of wonderful dexterity where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop Frog and a young girl, very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the 2 little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hop Frog and Trippetta were sure to be called into play. Hop Frog in especial was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye with every kind of device.
Okay, so that was just to give you a little bit of a taste of. I would encourage you to listen to the whole thing by Christopher Lee. I think that it's I think that it's a great reading. However, today we are going to read it again. And I actually have, by the way, if you're wondering where Dennis Speed is, who's usually here, um, he's sick and he'll be with us next week. So, with that, though, I have an alternative person who will be reading with us all the way from the great state of Texas. And I also have Kynan here to my left. Um, so, yeah, we're just going to do this again and get started. Here, hold on. Just want to check. Ashley, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, good. So the way we usually do this is a little weird without Dennis, to be honest. It's a little disconcerting, but hopefully hopefully we can suffice. And uh yeah. All right. So I think I have the story up there. And can you read that okay, Ashley? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
All right. So I think what I'll do is I'll be the narrator and the physical thing. Do you need a copy? Oh, you have it right there? Okay. Great. Okay, great. I think we should just start. Ashley, I think you will be. Who should you be? I'm looking here. Uh yeah, I'll be the narrator. Kynan, you can be the king. And then I'll fill in the characters as we go. Okay? Ashley? Is that
Yeah, yeah.
great? Okay, good. All right, so this is Hop Frog, published in 1849. And just so people get a sense of when that was his last year alive. He died in October of 1849. So this is, I guess, one of the last things he's writing. And the last place he lives is in the Bronx. So anyway, this is Hop Frog, or the Eight Chained Orangutans by Edgar Poe. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind and to tell it well was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris, or a rare bird. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghost of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley, with caps and bells, who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days, rather days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, sound, round, and unwieldy. So that it was no small source of self gratulation with our king that, in Hopfrog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hopfrog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the several ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hopfrog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king, for notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hopfrog, through the distortion of his legs, could only move with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises, he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hopfrog originally came. It was some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hopfrog and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hopfrog, who, although had he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not been in his power to render Trippetta many services. But she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it, whenever she could, for the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade. And whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hopfrog and Trippetta were sure to be called in play. Hopfrog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectations. As for the costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume, a week or even a month in advance. And, in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated, I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably, they found it difficult on account of being so fat to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and, as a last resource, they sent for Trippetta and Hopfrog. When the two little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council. But the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hopfrog to drink, and as the king called it, to be merry. Who's who again?
I'm the king.
You're the king? Okay, and then
Am I Hot Frog?
yeah, sure. Oh,
Okay.
also special shout out to Samantha. Oh, thank you, Samantha. Very nice. Anyway. Yeah.
Where are we?
Come here, Hopfrog,
Come here, Hopfrog.
said he as the jester and his friend entered the room.
Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends.
Is that still me? Oh, Here Hop Frog sighed.
And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man. Something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits.
Hop Frog endeavored as usual to get up a jest and replied to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant.
Ah,
Roared the latter as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker.
see what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already.
Poor fellow! His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with a half insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke.
And now to business.
Said the prime minister, a very fat man.
Yes.
Said the king.
Come, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us. Ha ha ha.
And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the seven. Hop Frog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly.
Come,
Said the king impatiently.
have you nothing to suggest?
I am endeavoring to think of something novel.
Replied the dwarf abstractly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine.
Endeavoring?
Cried the tyrant fiercely.
What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this.
And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath.
Drink, I say,
Shouted the monster.
or by the fiends.
The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best she could, and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about a minute and a half, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh, protracted grating sound which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room.
What? What? What are you making that noise for?
Demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated,
How could it have been me?
"The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires,"
True.
replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion.
But, on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth.
Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hop Frog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade.
I cannot tell what was the association of idea.
Observed he very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life.
But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades. But here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and
Here we are.
cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence.
8 to a fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?
We call it
Replied the cripple.
the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted.
We will enact it.
Remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids.
The beauty of the game
Continued Hop Frog.
lies in the fright it occasions among the women.
Capital! Roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry.
I will equip you as orangutans.
Proceeded the dwarf.
Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts. And of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished.
Oh, this is exquisite.
Exclaimed the king.
Hop Frog, I will make a man of you.
The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable.
It must be.
Said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog.
Do you want me to be the narrator here? I can, or does somebody else?
Am I doing a bad job? No, go ahead. Go ahead. You can be the narrator.
You just seem tired.
I'm a little tired, but go ahead.
Okay. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world. And as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, some one of the parties suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, then about all successfully in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete and the party stood as far from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance, as usual. But in order not to look unsightly, this ladder passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence. But in some particulars, it seemed she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who on account of the crowded state of the saloon could not all be expected to keep from out its center. That is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the war in a flambeau emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatids that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in altogether, for the impediment of their chains caused most of the party to fall and to stumble as they centered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposedly the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and, at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed closely at their heels, inciting them to keep the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier was drawn so far upward, and to take the hook out of reach, and as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes.
Leave them to me,
now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din.
Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are.
Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatids, he returned. And as he went to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming,
I shall soon find out who they are.
And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the train flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintaining his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down towards them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished were the whole company at this ascent that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But on the present occasion there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions.
Aha!
Said at length the infuriated jester.
Aha! I begin to see who these people are now.
Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, as he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain to be out of their reach. And as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke.
I now see distinctly,
he said,
what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy counselors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 counselors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog the jester, and this is my last jest.
Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
You know, I actually have to kind of ask myself, like, why did Poe write that in 1849? Any ideas, Ashley or Kynan?
Well, what's interesting about Frog is from another country, right? And it's not exactly specified what country it is, but they make reference to it being some barbarous, savage nation. And like, well, what kind of society is this? You know, that a king would actually slap a defenseless girl, and he's clearly, very depraved in the way he treats his people and everything. So like, we can be sympathetic, I guess, to Hopfrog in this revenge that he takes.
Yeah,
but I wouldn't know exactly why he would write it.
Well, in 1849, 1848 was when there was this height of revolution. And so this seems to be in light or a reflection of why people might have been seeking their own revolutions against their aristocratic governance or their monarchs.
Say more. Like who exactly, or what? What do you mean?
Well, there were several different revolutions that were occurring at the time across Europe. There wasn't anything that was specific in mind, but that was just more of what I was thinking in terms of what I remember from learning in history was just across all of Europe. And at the time, most of the European countries were ruled with a monarch.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, I see. I just looked up the revolutions of 1848, or also known as the Springtime of Nations.
Yeah.
or the Year of Revolutions were a series of widespread revolutionary movements across Europe from 1848 to 1849. Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
even know this happened.
Yeah, that was what I was referencing. Was just the slew of revolutions across Europe.
Oh, oh, okay.
Well, I was also thinking about the story about the mummy and how the mummy is, well, talking to them because they're lecturing the mummy, like, oh, did you have democracy in your time, right? And then the mummy, I guess, tells them the story about the 13 states or so in Egypt which revolted and formed this republic,
Yeah.
but that it later descended into tyranny. And that was a clear reference, of course, to the United States, the 13 colonies. And I forget when that was written again, but I'm assuming it was around the same time, 1849 or so, one of his last stories. But also I was just thinking about events that were happening, and there was the Mexican American War, which had been concluded in 1848, and that was seen, for example, by Lincoln, who was a representative at the time, as clearly an unjust war. And there was the whole famous spot resolution, about where was the spot specifically in which Mexicans attacked American troops or whatever. That was the cause of the war. But clearly it was an imperial war which expanded the slave power in the United States. So yeah, just to go to what you were saying, Ashley, about these revolutions that were happening in 1848.
Wow. All right. Well, I don't have much more to add. It's almost 7:00, and we don't have Dennis. So should we stop here?
Any comments?
Just
Well,
Samantha, who said she was happy that we were reading Poe again, and that she feels like she knows us because we were all at the conference on our youth panel.
are there any comments about the story that people
No.
want to make? No? Okay.
I don't see any on the story, no?
No, but I'm not saying necessarily from the
Oh, you
chat.
mean from me or Kynan?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty violent story. He lights them up on fire.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something I had a question about too, was why that as revenge?
Yeah.
Pretty brutal. Well, also, this is my second time reading the story, but I didn't notice at first that the sound that the king and others were asking about was actually coming from the hop frog gnashing his teeth.
Yeah.
But also, they kind of make it clear at the end also that this wasn't like a parrot or something. This was him gnashing his teeth in rage about because of what the king did to Tripetta.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that the dwarf is the one who seeks revenge. Not just it's not from the jester immediately.
Thank you, Isaiah.
Oh yeah. Any of you have thoughts in the beginning about how it's most likely that a fat person is a good jester or joke teller or whatever?
I think it's pretty true.
Was it like 90% of them?
No, he doesn't give a specific percentage. He's just saying that a lean joker is a rare bird on Earth.
Yeah, but also it's the question of what kind of joke was it?
Yeah.
Because the fat people that enjoyed jokes were like the king and his companions, and the type of jokes that they enjoyed or jokes were just like torturous, like just watching the dwarf go mad, or wanted to watch people in pain and laugh at them. So yeah, there's this, like how I kind of understood that, where these people, the fat people, which are just the monarchs that are in excess and have never had to deal with pain because they have everything provided for them. Like the idea of it is so foreign that it's laughable. That's kind of how, that's the irony that I read in that statement at the beginning. Did you have any thoughts, Kynan?
No, I was just kind of asking the question. But yeah, I think it was clearly aimed towards this ironic sentiment that Poe had, and just a reflection of the kind of society that it was. Like the king enjoying getting Hop Frog, drunk, filling him with all kind of wine and stuff. It was, yeah.
Being told that there was a comment sent in, but yeah, I don't see it. All right. We got a light crowd today. Go
I
ahead.
guess I have one more thing, but this is clearly this is like one of Poe's revenge stories, right? And it's clearly a contrast with the other revenge story. I think we read Cask of Amontillado, where the guy, he lures him into this, I forget where he lures him, but he lures him under the pretense of getting him this this wine bottle, Amontillado, which is very lucrative, and he does it because he insulted him at one point. And we really don't even know like what the insult was, but it was implied that it was really petty, and that this murder is, quite sadistic in the way it's being carried out. But here in this case, I mean, there is a justified anger on the part of Hop Frog, I would say, who's treated like a slave, basically, like by the king. So just thinking back to what we read before.
All right. Okay. I'm going to end it here. This is good for substitution with okay. All right. Isaiah has something. I mean, does it mean that we must try and end our tyranny at whatever end? I mean, there was a civil war that was necessary to fight if it's over. There was a civil war that was necessary to fight if it's over principle. It's a good question. I guess it just comes back to what Kyan said at the beginning. It's like, what kind of society do you have where that is the only way forward? What is Hop Frog to do? 10 years later, there would be an outbreak of a civil war. Any thoughts on that, Ashley?
This it seems like from the story there's clearly like revenge that's happening, and there's an escape, but what does it actually say anything about bringing about a different leadership or different governance? I don't think that the story really says anything about that. But something that is that I thought was interesting was more of, I think, like what it could possibly be talking more about is what the creativity of Hot Frog, because even when he's bringing out this elaborate plan, it's pretty obvious that he thought out everything very meticulously, and how to construct the chandelier so that it could be easily it could like lift them all up and out so that they could not escape, the orangutans. And then also how he's able to emotionally manipulate the kings from their own weaknesses of loving jokes, wanting to be a part of this practical joke. So yeah, like I thought there's this idea that this dwarf who's supposedly from a barbarous country and has nothing to offer besides being a practical joke has a lot, is an intelligent person and is not just seeing himself as a slave, even though that is how he's treated.
Yeah.
What if it's? Yeah, I didn't think of that. Probably.
Wait, I can't hear Kynan.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, what if Poe is actually writing about American slavery and the consequences of not destroying the institution? You know, what could actually happen, you know, as a result of not doing the right thing.
Yeah. Oh, an anti-slavery document. Or wow.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you would implicitly be talking about it's 1849.
Right.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
it's still an issue, Poe would know it's still an issue.
Yeah.
Right. And he goes back to his country at the end.
Yeah.
He goes back to his original country, and it's not stated where he's from, you know, but it's clear that he was brought there against his will.
Oh wow. Yeah. Wow. Good point there, guys. I'm glad we stayed and talked about it more.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that seems like the relevance of what this story is about.
Oh, sorry. This came in Velasquez portrait of dwarf in King Philip Court, done with dignity, like Pareja. Oh, yeah. I know the one she's talking about.
Can you pull it up?
Yeah, I was just doing that. Anyway, yes, I can pull it up. Actually, hold on. Pop this here. Do this. Do this. Do this. Do this. Do this. Do this. I mean, yeah, it is done with dignity. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. It's in his facial expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. I like it. Well, good comments, guys. Yeah, show painting. Thank you. Oh man. All right, guys. I think that's a great place to end it. And this Pareja inscribed his name as well. Where? I'm trying to. I don't see it either.
Maybe all the way on the bottom, right?
That just looks like a number, 250 something.
Yeah.
Well, regardless, guys, I want to thank all of you again for coming on our weekly Poe class. I promise Dennis will be back next week. And so with that, yeah, thanks everybody for coming on.